For more than 50 years, Massachusetts Advocates for Children has been trying to help students with the greatest risk of being left behind or even being pushed out. That mission has taken on more urgency during the pandemic, especially for students with disabilities and language learners. To help with its efforts, Mass Advocates will hold a virtual event on Friday, a run, walk, and roll to equity. To tell us about the event and what's being supported is the organization's executive director, Kevin Murray. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us, Kevin.
No, thank you, Chris, for having me.
Kevin, I want to start with the urgency of the pandemic and the students that you work with most often. What has it been like for them?
It's been a different situation in every family, but we've been contacted over the course of the pandemic by many, many families around in Boston, around Massachusetts, for whom this has been a really difficult time. Many of those families are families of students with disabilities. They're families of English learners. There's a lot of different reasons why people have had real challenges. The first thing that we really had to deal with was the whole question of access to technology, which is something that we focused on a lot in the early months of the pandemic. And unfortunately, it's something we've had to continue to give attention to. As time has passed, we've worked a lot with school districts and with families. Basically, families have been telling us that they felt a real urgent need in many of their situations to get their children back into some kind of face-to-face, in-person services. And they were as aware of as anybody of the dangers and the necessity to do that safely. But a lot of our work in the last period has been working with school districts on how that could be achieved, how some of these most highest need students could get back into in-person services, because the remote education system, however much effort people were putting into it, was just not working for those families. So that's been a big concern.
I know some students, at least at a certain stage, can do very well with remote education, but on the other hand, the students you work with, let's say students with autism, what do they miss when they're not in a classroom setting, rather, especially in an inclusive classroom?
Right. Well, that's the, being at home on a computer is sort of as far away from the opposite of inclusion as you can get, right? So for many students, just the attention span of, for I myself, the amount of time that I'm spending on Zoom in a day is creating some challenges for me. For many of these students, just the effort that it required at the family level to get them to attend, to be focused on a computer screen for a period of time was really difficult. And for them, for many of these students, the personal attention, the individual attention has been very important to their educational gains, to their ability to benefit from the education system. They've gotten very little of this during this time. And it requires of the entire family, they need to have somebody who's right there with them in many cases, participating in the remote education session with them. And that's difficult for the family. Not every family can handle that, right? So the fact is, many families have contacted us, excuse me, to tell us that because they are able to be right there with their student, there's actually been some benefits to this situation. But that has by far not been the majority of the circumstances that we've heard about. For the majority of students, they've really missed the socialization of the contact with other students, the direct support of teachers and other staff. All students have missed that, but many students with disabilities, especially students with autism, have had an especially hard time in the absence of that, and the other specialized services that they get by being in school.
Well, for language learners, I can imagine compounded problems because on the one hand, nominal access to technology can mean maybe one device for, 4 or 5 people and limited time to use it, plus the difficulties of working by ear in another language. You don't have time to slow things down and, look at a text and then check the dictionary. What does that do to these students?
Well, a lot of the students that we work with face both those challenges, right? They face language challenges as well as challenges associated with a disability. And it's been students at that intersection that I think our experiences have had a particularly hard time now. And I think most of it's been very, I mean, remote education has been a tremendous challenge for schools and teachers, but especially teachers trying to teach English learners with a variety of skill levels in English remotely using a computer for exactly the reasons you talked about has been really difficult. If you compound that with the large number of students in a district like Boston that face both challenges around language and disability challenges, then you're dealing with a really difficult, a close to impossible situation in the remote context, I would say.
Well, the next chapter is more students going back to school and in-person learning. I know you've got a chat planned around that for some students, but what are the challenges there that you're most worried about?
There are a few. We believe that as students go back to school, given what the experience, I mean, we see this for many students as having been another traumatic experience. There's been trauma in this situation because of the situation of the pandemic and because of what they faced in terms of remote learning. So students are coming back to school after this situation. We anticipate that there'll be a lot of behavioral challenges. People have been out of the school context for a long time. How are schools going to react to those behavioral challenges? We know there has to be some approach to it. Our fear is that the tool that is most easily accessible to schools is punitive discipline, right? Exclusion of students, various forms of disciplinary action against students, et cetera. And that to us is going to be, we understand why districts may respond with that kind of response, but that's going to be that's not going to be the answer for many of these students when they come back. So we're seeing a big challenge to face in terms of addressing this question of discipline during the return to school. Another tool that, especially for students with disabilities, given how much learning challenge there's been during this period, there will be a reaction on the part of some districts to want to increase the segregation of those students in non-inclusive environments, right, in substantially separate environments. We also don't think that's going to be a positive solution in this time. So we're expecting to get a lot of calls, a lot of need to respond to situations in which that kind of exclusion or segregation into sub-separate environments is a response that districts take. And we're sensitive to the challenges that districts face. None of us would underestimate what it's going to mean to districts to have these students back. We just believe that we've got to find some alternatives to that, both those forms of exclusion, the disciplinary exclusion and the exclusion into sub-separate environments. Those are two tools that we're hopeful won't be overused.
At least historically, there is this racial divide in access to inclusive settings for students with disabilities. You must be more aware of that maybe now because of what's been happening the past year.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge problem before the past year. And in the past year, what we expect is when students go back to school, the same racial patterns in the way students get placed in substantially separate environments will become aggravated, right? So the racial equity challenge or the racial equity deficit that would happen in resort to that kind of exclusion is something that we're really concerned about. In Massachusetts, the data is not easily available, but right before the pandemic, we got some data regarding the placement of students in sub-separate environments. And 25%, slightly over 25% of white male students with disabilities are in sub-separate environments. For Black boys, that percentage is over 50%. So it's over twice as many. And the 25% we believe is a high figure. That's an unacceptably high figure. But the 50%, over 50% for Black boys is just entirely off the charts.
Well, to talk about equity, of course, this is one of the reasons underlying the event on Friday. And I guess this sort of coincides with Mass Advocates being part of a Boston political history, since the current mayor used to work for Mass Advocates.
Yes, Mayor Janey spent 17 years as the director of MAC's Boston School Reform Project. So she led for many years and really established the foundation of our work with the Boston Public Schools focused on racial equity issues. So it's very exciting. It was exciting for us to see her become part of the city council, and now in the mayor's role, that's even more exciting. This is a real advocate for Boston students.
Well, I want to ask you about the event on Friday, because this is run, walk, or roll if necessary. How are people going to be able to do this?
Uh, Anybody can participate. We would love to be able to gather a bunch of people together at some point over the weekend. It's a weekend long. You can do it anytime this weekend. You can do a 5K. You can register on our website, which is www.massadvocates.org. You can register for our 5K walk. It pops up immediately when you go to the website. You can do the walk at your leisure. You can roll, you can run. Just sign up and send us photos of doing it. We're going to do on Thursday evening, we're going to do a launch, our starting line at 7 p.m. There's information about that on the website as well, just to bring together people who are doing this. We'd love to bring everybody together in one place on Saturday morning, but it's just not the moment for that. So we're giving people the opportunity to do this virtually, roll, walk, or run. Do it with friends, do it with family, but do it for equity this weekend.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great, as always, to have the opportunity to speak with you about these issues.
Thank you very much. That's Kevin Murray from Mass Advocates for Children. We'll have more news in just a moment.